and today's topic is international organizations. Now, today's video will be a little bit longer than the normal ones because international organizations usually covers 2 lectures in our course, but rather than upload 2 separate videos with kind of an artificial breaking point, I'm just going to record one long video. If you get bored or need a break, you can take breaks whenever you'd like. All right, so what are international organizations? Well, they're a set of different institutions that include intergovernmental organizations, which are things like the UN or the European Union, non-governmental organizations, which are things such as Médecins Sans Frontières or Amnesty International. And so it's a wide grouping of different types of organizations. And we're going to spend most of the time today talking about intergovernmental organizations. But it's also important to remember that there's many, many different NGOs. There's thousands of different NGOs that are spread across the world. And some of them play important roles in many different international events. So what are intergovernmental organizations then? Those are organizations whose members include at least 3 states that have activities in several states and whose members are held together by a formal intergovernmental agreement, right? So if you just have 2 states that have made an agreement together, it doesn't qualify as an intergovernmental organization. So if just Canada and the US make an agreement, that may have legal status, but it doesn't qualify as an intergovernmental organization. It has to have activities in several states, right? So, and its members are held together by a formal intergovernmental agreement, right? So you need some type of agreement that holds, these together. It can't just be an informal arrangement between 3 or more states. There has to be some form of formalization. There's approximately 400 different independent intergovernmental organizations around the world, covering a whole range of different topics and sizes and issue areas and everything like that. We're not going to obviously learn about all of them. Today, we're just going to focus on, some of the most prominent ones and what they do. So to look at intergovernmental organizations, we need some tools, right? We need some ways to be able to organize them, to categorize them, because with 400 different groups, and then once you get into NGOs, you're dealing with thousands of different groups. Not all of them are going to operate the same. We're not going to see the same behavior. We're not going to see the same power. So we need some way of organizing them. And so here's 3 different ways that we could potentially organize intergovernmental organizations, right? So we can look at them in terms of size, right? And you see a huge different range here, right? For example, you have tiny ones like North America Free Trade Agreement, or now the US MCA agreement, because it was recently replaced, but like NAFTA had 3 member states, Canada, US, and Mexico. The Universal Postal Union, which is one of our oldest intergovernmental organizations, has about 190 members, right? So that's a huge difference in terms of scope. And then you have organizations ranging from 3 all the way up to more than 190, and all sizes in between. We can look at different geographic scope, right? And so we can look at organizations that are focused in one region, so Organization of American States, which would be focused in the Americas, or you'd have the European Union in Europe, and APEC in Asia Pacific. So you'd have different organizations that are just regional focused. They don't deal with global issues; they deal with issues that are more focused. And then we have many global international organizations, right, that deal with issues that are across regions that span the entire world. So an example would be the World Bank, the UN, and so these ones will have a larger geographic scope. And then different purposes. Different international organizations try to do different things. And here again, we can kind of categorize them based on, some try to do a little bit of everything. Some of particularly your biggest ones, will have kind of a general focus, right? The idea is just to bring together different members, but they're going to deal with multiple different topics. So the prominent one here would be the United Nations, which deals with many, many, many different issue areas. But it's hard to create general purpose, particularly large organizations. So most organizations are more limited in what they try to deal with. So you have many specialized ones, and they're focused in one or a few issue areas. So an example here would be the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, which deal with oil production quotas and kind of setting the oil prices. And it's just petroleum exporting countries that could be members. And so it's really dealing with that only that topic or topics that are related to petroleum exporting. If, not to say that other topics are important, but they're beyond the purview of, let's say, a group like, or an organization like OPEC would deal with. They also have different functions, right? When we look at intergovernmental organizations, we can see that they will do one or more of these different, one or more of these different functions, right? So some of them will serve an informational role, which includes gathering, analyzing, and disseminating data, which is important, as we've talked about with multiple theories that we've looked at before. Many problems that we find in international politics stem from the fact that it's hard to gather information about, the situation, about what others are doing. And so intergovernmental organizations, by providing information, can help to solve many of these problems. They provide a function as a forum, so providing a place for exchange of views and decision-making. So a place where you can have regularized discussions between different parties on issues that may be important to them. And they can discuss views and hopefully are able to reach decisions. They can serve a normative role. And this is something a lot, for example, that a lot of constructivist literature might talk about, the normative role in intergovernmental organizations, defining standards of behavior, right? So what is appropriate in terms of behavior for people to do? They serve a rule creating function, drafting legally binding treaties. So they can define standards of behavior in more kind of a sociological, this is the appropriate way to behave, but they can also create international law. Rule supervisory. So after rules have been created, you need someone who can actually monitor are states actually complying with the agreement. And so the intergovernmental organization is often well placed to monitor compliance with rules, settle disputes, and take enforcement measures. Now, monitoring compliance is often the easiest of these three, and followed by settling disputes, and enforcement is oftentimes very difficult, even for the best intergovernmental organizations. But this is one of the goals of IGOs. Operational. So allocating resources, providing technical assistance, relief, and deploying forces. Many IGOs, they actually do things too, right? So, the UN might deploy peacekeepers or, provide help on the ground. And this can be really useful in terms of providing resources in areas where it's needed and can sometimes do it very quickly. But also many countries that may be members of intergovernmental organizations who are experiencing problems, oftentimes they have technical deficiencies, right? Or they may not have much state capacity. They may not have experts in the relevant areas. And an IGO can come in and bring in experts from around the world who are able to solve those problems, right? So you can definitely have, and particularly in a lot of less developed countries where you do see lower state capacity or lower expertise in many different areas, the IGO can send in technical experts to help. All right, so I want to look at one global purpose IGO because it's one that is of high prominence in international politics, and that's the United Nations. So we're going to look a little bit at its history and its membership, what it does, and its structure. And then we'll move on to some specialized or more restricted ones. So this one's interesting because it's a global and general purpose, right? So it's bringing together the whole world and all issue areas. So the United Nations was founded in 1945 with all peace-loving nations eligible for membership. And I put peace-loving in quotes because the way that peace-loving at the time was defined was pretty much, winners of World War II. If you lost World War II, you were not at that time a peace-loving nation. If you won World War II, you were pretty much eligible to be considered a peace-loving nation. As is common with many international organizations, particularly the large international organizations that are founded at the end of wars, they take on the shape of what, the victor's desire. And so you definitely see the imprint of the previous war on the structure of the organization. There's currently about 193 member states. Now, since World War II, the United Nations has been the central piece of global governance, right? As the global general purpose IGO, it's the one that's most publicly visible, usually. It's the one where we put kind of the highest hopes in terms of solving many problems, because it's the only IGO with global scope and newly universal membership, right? So it's the only organization that can bring together everybody at the same time, and that can cover all of the different issue areas, not just one, but can look at international politics in a more holistic manner. The establishment of the United Nations in the closing days of World War II was the affirmation of the desire of war-weary nations for an organization that could help them avoid future conflict. And we see this at the end of many great wars, many of the kind of the largest wars, that at the end of the war, countries are tired from the war, and they want to find an organization, or they want to find a way that can help them avoid future conflict. So we see this with the UN after World War II. We saw this with the League of Nations after World War I, and the Concert of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. And in many important ways, the structure of the United Nations was patterned after that of the League of Nations, right? So we kind of took what we had learned from the successes of the League of Nations where they existed, what seemed to work, but also the League of Nations had many failures. So in designing the United Nations, we kind of tried to take from, the best of what the League of Nations accomplished while avoiding the worst failures. So there definitely was, some evidence of learning, particularly in terms of the Security Council and the permanent membership in the Security Council for the Permanent Five. So let's look at some of the key principles that make up the backbone of the United Nations. The first is the principle of sovereign equality of member states, right? So that means that on its face, all member states are equal to each other. So there's none that are above, none are below, right? And that's based on the principle of sovereignty. It doesn't matter whether you're large or small. All member states are sovereign over their territory, and that means that they should be treated as equal. Now, interestingly, when we'll look at some of the structures, not all members are always completely equal within the UN, but this was important. Some of these kind of deviations were important for other principles. Twin principles of peace and security. So all member states shall refrain from threat of or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any manner inconsistent with the United Nations purposes, and settle their international disputes by peaceful means. So if a dispute arises between different states, to use peaceful means, and never issue any threats of the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any states, right? So at its core, well, the United Nations does many different things, because it was created at the end of World War II to try to avoid wars. At its core, its primary goal is peace, right? Where it's different from some of the organizations whose primary goal is peace is that after the failures of the League of Nations, the creators of the UN realized that if you want to maintain peace, you can't just be dealing with military security, right? Maintaining peace and security requires bringing together economic and social issues as well. There's an obligation built in to support enforcement action. So if there is a breach to the peace, all members are technically obligated to help in enforcement actions to the best of their abilities. And so the best of their abilities is run in the principle of good faith effort to fulfill all obligations, right? But it doesn't mean that all states will always be successful in fully living up to the terms of, the UN Charter or UN decisions, but they must put in place a good faith effort to get there. So they have to try their best. Non-intervention in domestic affairs. So nothing in the present charter. So this is a quote from the Charter of the United Nations. Nothing in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present charter. Right. So this kind of fits within the sovereign equality. While the United Nations deals with international issues, it isn't supposed to be dealing with purely domestic issues, because states are sovereign over what happens in this territory. Now, there's a lot of tension over this point, right? Because some states hold very, very strongly to this principle, but other states have found that there needs to be exceptions here, right? In the terms, if there's a humanitarian crisis in the state, if the state is, abusing its people, if there's a genocide or ethnic cleansing within a state, many interventions that we've seen through the UN have, particularly more recent ones, have involved some element of interference or intervention in domestic affairs, under the idea that, by mistreating the people to a certain extent, the government has given up its right to claim non-intervention. And this is done through kind of some of the principles relating to the rights of people that are built into the Charter and human rights documentation within the United Nations. But we definitely see some tension here, right? Do you have the right to interfere in a civil war if you're not invited? Do you have the right to interfere in a genocide if you're not invited? And then Article 51, which is kind of the core of some of the self-defense, or this is a security organization. But it's also a principle that many other security organizations, particularly NATO, have pointed to many times, is the right of individual or collective self-defense, right? So if attacked, although an attack is always against the UN Charter, states have the right of individual or collective self-defense. So if Canada is attacked, Canada has the right to defend itself, but it also has the right to have friends help defend itself, right? So collective self-defense. So the United States or other NATO members could come to Canada's defense too. And this is the principle that NATO has invoked for many of its different interventions, the principle of collective self-defense. So this is the United Nations system, the kind of the structure. So on the left here, we have the principal organs, right? These 6 principal organs that make up the United Nations. And under each of these different principal organs, you have a variety of different agencies and bodies. Obviously, you're not going to have to memorize all of these. This is just to try to show a little bit of the scope of everything that the UN tries to handle. You should definitely, and we're going to go more in detail onto the UN principal organs, so you should definitely memorize all of those and a little bit of what they do, and take a look at the different organs and agencies and stuff like that, or bodies and agencies. But you certainly don't have to memorize all of these. All right, so let's start looking through the different major organs of the United Nations. We're going to start with the General Assembly. And this is designed as a general debate arena where all UN members would be equally accepted according to a one state, one vote formula. So if you remember going back to our sovereign equality, in the General Assembly, all states are equal. So it doesn't matter, if you're a large state or a powerful state or giving a lot, that doesn't give you an increased share of the vote. It's the organization's hub with a diverse agenda and responsibility for coordinating and supervising subsidiary bodies, but with power only to make recommendations to members, except on internal matters such as elections and budget. So the GA, the General Assembly, does have some powers when it comes to electing members to some of the important bodies that do things in the United Nations. They even have membership in the Security Council, and related to the UN budget. But other than that, while it definitely has an important normative role in terms of it can, vote and show its desires on things. Resolutions don't have kind of force of international law, or don't really have anything backing them up. So it's more of just while it's very strong on the normative sense of democracy, one state, one vote, it is weak in terms of its power to actually do anything forcefully. It relies on the normative power of its democratic ideals to have any influence. The Security Council is a body which has a little bit more teeth. So it has primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security, and the authority to act on behalf of all member states of the UN. Provisions for carrying out the role are spelled out in chapters 6 and 7 of the Charter. Chapter 6 deals with peaceful settlement of disputes, providing a wide range of techniques to investigate disputes and help parties achieve resolutions without using force. So chapter 6 is invoked often if you don't need to bring in force to settle a dispute. And chapter 7 specifies the Security Council's authority to identify aggressors and commit all UN members to take enforcement measures such as economic sanctions or provide military forces for joint action. So if the Security Council is unable to resolve a dispute using peaceful settlement techniques, and there has been a breach of the peace, then Chapter 7 allows the Security Council to make a decision on military or forceful intervention. The membership of the United Security Council, or the United Nations Security Council, is something actually of fairly intense debate in terms of who should be members. It has 5 permanent members currently, and of particular importance, these 5 members have veto power. So Security Council operates on a principle of majority votes, with the exception that these 5 permanent members, if one of them votes against something, a resolution, then it automatically fails. So the 5 permanent members are the US, UK, France, Russia. Russia succeeded and took over the Soviet Union seat, and the People's Republic of China, who took over the Republic of China's seat in 1971. So these are the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And then there's 10 rotating non-permanent members serving 2-year terms. And so that's based on an election of who's going to hold these different seats. There's been intense debate over whether these are the appropriate 5 permanent members. There's not too much geographic diversity. There's questions on who's most powerful. Should there be permanent memberships in Africa or Latin America? There's other states that have risen in how much they're donating to the UN in Japan and Germany. So should any of those states or groups be given permanent seats? Should there be more rotating members? There's intense debate about expanding membership. Unfortunately, like all political things, the debate over what the ideal composition of the Security Council should be tends to be political. For example, if Germany is saying, well, we donate a lot to the United Nations, we should have a permanent seat, well, some of the countries that are most likely to oppose it would be some of the European rivals who see Germany doesn't or they think that if Germany gets one, they deserve one too. They don't want to see Germany's status raised without their status. If India says, we're have more than 1 billion people, we're a rising power, we're the largest democracy, we deserve a permanent seat. While India's regional rivals are likely to say, no, India, we don't want you to have this seat, right? So they're likely to vote against any plan that sees India getting a permanent seat. If Brazil says, we're the largest state in South America, rising power, we deserve a seat, well, many of the regional rivals in South America are likely to oppose that plan. You know, and then trying to figure out which country, say in Africa, would get a seat. Well, all the different, uh, states that hope to get a more prominent position in Africa will oppose, choosing one state or a particular state that's not them for getting the seat. So this has been kind of fraught with problems. There's multiple plans that are floating around with multiple kind of alliance of states backing different plans, but none can get and there's many principles that many people agree on in terms of what should happen, but it's been impossible to find wide-ranging agreement or any plan that can get a majority of states to get past the hurdle to actually credibly make it happen. Now this permanent members with veto definitely creates kind of a two-class of states. You've got those who are always having power and they have even a different voting system versus other states who have to rotate in, only serve 2-year terms and don't have a veto. So this definitely kind of seems to go against the sovereign equality. But the reason that this decision was made was learning from kind of some of the mistakes of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations had problems where so the US wasn't in. Many of the most powerful states weren't kind of in or taking the League of Nations seriously. The League of Nations wasn't really able to follow up on anything. At the end of the day, at a certain point, it really became that if the League of Nations were to do anything, it meant the UK had to do it pretty much alone. And the UK just didn't have the power to do so. And so the framers of the United Nations and kind of everyone who signed on to the United Nations, even those who aren't those powers, said that we're willing to give up some level of sovereign equality on the idea that for a collective security organization to maintain peace, it requires the most powerful states in the world. And so that's kind of the idea behind we give, the rest of the states of the world, we give concessions to the most powerful ones on, kind of the idea that when push comes to shove and there is a breach of the peace, we're going to need those most powerful states to be acting and to be leading. And the organization is dead in the water if it doesn't have those most powerful states. Some of the problems become, though, the framers never really thought about what happens for transition. What happens if these 5 are no longer the most powerful 5 states in the world? Or what happens if new actors arise? Do we expand? What do we do? The third organ is the Economic and Social Council, or Ecosoc, and it covers the broadest area of activity, the majority of expenditures, and the greatest number of programs. So actually, most of the things the UN actually does falls under the purview of Ecosoc. And so Ecosoc handles kind of the budget or the expenditures for that, and is in some way or form in charge of all of those different organizations that fall under its purview. So if we just go back, so Ecosoc would be covering kind of all of these different programs over here. So there's a good number of them. And so they're in charge then of coordinating of the activities of these specialized agencies focused on economic and social advancement. Now, the ability to actually do so is sometimes, or their ability to do so is sometimes limited. Many of the specialized agencies that fall under Ecosoc are actually quite powerful in and of themselves, and Ecosoc has very little kind of authority to tell them what to do. So while they, on some level supervise those agencies on in many cases, many of the specialized agencies that fall under Ecosoc are largely autonomous. The Secretariat. So the United Nations is an organization, and every kind of formal organization requires some level of kind of bureaucracy to make it function. And the United Nations has headquarters, it has multiple agencies, it has multiple different offices around the world, has different agencies with offices, and so the UN requires some level of just kind of staffing to make the day-to-day functions of the United Nations operate. So there's about 7,500 professional and clerical staff based in New York, Geneva, Vienna, Nairobi, which are made for the headquarters and then major offices of the United Nations, and then different offices around the world. And these are international civil servants. So while they're nationals of their member countries, they are supposed to represent the international community. So, if I'm a Canadian working at the United Nations as a member of the staff, well, I maintain my Canadian citizenship, but I'm performing my functions as a staff member of the UN. My Canadian citizenship or my Canadian identity is not supposed to inform the decisions that I make. I'm not supposed to be taking actions that will benefit Canada. I'm supposed to, just operate on behalf of the United Nations. The Secretary General is the manager of the organization, responsible for providing leadership to the Secretariat, preparing the UN's budget. So while the General Assembly, votes kind of on the budget and it's prepared by the Secretariat, they submit annual reports to the General Assembly and overseeing studies conducted at the request of other major organs. So oftentimes different organs will ask the Secretariat to prepare different reports, prepare information, and then the Secretary General will turn to the staff, the experts that they have on hand to prepare the reports. Article 99 of the Charter authorizes Secretary General to bring to the attention of the Security Council any matter which in his or her opinion may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security. So while it's the Security Council's prerogative to act and make the decisions based on what it views as threats to the international community, the Secretary General can bring any item and put it on the agenda for the Security Council saying, you should be taking a look at this. What decisions they make on that is their prerogative, but the Secretary General can at least call attention to it, which is at least an important symbolic power and at times could, even have an effect. The International Court of Justice is the judicial arm of the UN, but separating this from the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice is dealing with states, not with individuals. So the International Court of Justice shares responsibility with other major organs for ensuring that the principles of the Charter are followed. Special role is providing states with an impartial body for settling legal disputes in accordance with international law and giving advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by international agencies. So if two countries are having disputes or having legal disputes, they can bring each other to the International Court of Justice, and then an international panel of judges will rule on the case involving more than one state based on international law. What they often will also do is, rather than referring cases, different states or international agencies can go for advisory opinions saying, we're thinking of doing this. We'd like to implement this policy. We'd like to take this action, but before doing so, we'd like to see, is this acceptable under international law? And so then the International Court of Justice will take a look and give its opinion on whether this is acceptable. And then finally, the Trusteeship Council, which at present, there's no text below because at present isn't really doing anything. So when the United Nations was first formed, there was kind of moving towards a wave of decolonization and hoping for decolonization. Now, while the victor states, so the UK, France, in particular, were given, they're supposed to move towards decolonization, but at the pace that they could decide on. But there were other colonies of the states that lost that weren't ready for statehood yet, but they didn't have a colonizer anymore. And so they're put under the jurisdiction of the Trusteeship Council, who were supposed to help them build up state capacity so that they could become an independent member of the UN and become a strong state in the future. So they were kind of those states were put in trust with the Trusteeship Council, who was kind of to act on their behalf in terms of helping them to advance and develop the institutions required for full statehood and full independence. the reason that the Trusteeship Council doesn't do so anymore is there are no longer any states that are actually in trust. All of them have reached their own capacity to, not be covered by the Trusteeship Council, and so they don't really have anything to do anymore. There's been multiple, debates about what the Trusteeship Council could do in the future. Can it be repurposed? It's got, a really nice room in the UN headquarters, which is sitting empty, not really accomplishing anything. So there's been multiple debates, including things like, environmental stewardship or stuff like that. They could be put under the Trusteeship Council, but at present there's been no agreement as to what that would look like. So here's just kind of a list of some of the affiliated organizations, just to show kind of, many of them are ones that you may have seen before operating, and these kind of fall under the affiliated organizations. So they're under the UN's banner, and many of them falling under Ecosoc's purview. So you've got Food and Agriculture Organization, International Civil Aviation Organization, which is noteworthy for many of the viewers here because ICAO is located in Montreal. It's the only UN affiliated organization in Canada. There's the International Fund for Agricultural Development, International Labour Organization, International Monetary Organization, International Monetary Fund, International Telecommunications Union, UNESCO, United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, Universal Postal Union, World Bank Group, World Health Organization, which is getting a lot of airtime with everything going on with COVID-19, World International Property Organization, World Meteorological Organization, and World Tourism Organization. All right, so that's kind of an introduction, a very quick introduction to the United Nations. Now I'm going to turn to the regional general purpose IGO. So before we're looking at a global general purpose organization, now we're going to focus on a regional one. So, and for that, we're going to look at the European Union. Because the European Union is always an interesting case study because it's managed to accomplish deeper integration than any other international organization in the world, and it's done many things that many people never really thought possible in terms of kind of getting to an organization that where states really give up some of their sovereignty. That's almost a supranational organization that's above states and has some level of sovereignty. So this is a kind of map of the territory covered by United Nations. It's actually no longer accurate because of the UK, which is because Brexit actually occurred. It's not a member, but the rest of this would be accurate. So we've got the dark blue are current members. The slightly lighter blue are official candidates. So these are states that are on the pathway to becoming members of the European Union. And then there's kind of the very light blue are those recognized as potential candidates. So ones who aren't on kind of the official pathway, who don't have official steps and negotiations. Oftentimes these states are the ones who are official candidates are given kind of goals they must reach or reforms they must make before they actually can become members. And once they accomplish those, then they could be brought in as members. And the recognized as potential candidates, they're still further off. So the two recognized as potential candidates, so you've got Bosnia and Kosovo. So Kosovo, some of its problems may be related to recognized as statehood. Bosnia's major obstacles, I believe, were related to subnational organizations having control over weaponry and kind of having separate military forces, which Bosnia has been moving to resolve in creating a united military force for all of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that may help them upgrade. And most of the ones that are official candidates, are in kind of the Balkans region, other former Yugoslav republics in particular. Croatia has already become a member, and Turkey. And Turkey's actually had a very long and fraught negotiations with the European Union. It's gone back and forth. Many debates as to whether, even if Turkey meets all of the requirements set out by the EU, whether it would ever be given membership. That's hard to know. It's also hard to know with Brexit happening and some negative turns in some of the EU members in terms of their democratic credentials. Thinking of countries like Hungary, which and there's others that have definitely taken steps backwards in terms of their level of democracy. It'll be interesting to see whether this is going to put a little bit of a hold on some of whether these states want to or are want to join the EU or are accepted into the EU. We'll also see whether you see, particularly right after the Brexit vote, there's a lot of debate whether other countries were going to leave too. The short-term answer has been no, but we'll see what ends up happening, particularly if we fall into another deep recession, which could end up leading to some type of crisis for the EU if they can't manage it. We'll also see what the COVID-19 fallout is, whether people assess that was the EU effective in dealing with it, or did states just go back to their national self-interest? So those are all questions that moving forward the EU is going to have to look at. I know, like for example, in Serbia, which is an official candidate, many people there have complained that during the COVID-19 crisis, they got their help not from the European Union, but from China. And the European Union, dealt only with, Germany dealt with German problems, or France dealt with France problems, and whatnot. So we'll see if, that changes support for the EU. So this is kind of a map of the EU power structure with a separation between the legislative branch in yellow, executive branch in blue, and judicial branch in gray. And the arrow is kind of pointing to who decides on what. One of the really interesting and unique things about the European Union is here. Right? So the usual pathway for how people have an influence on intergovernmental organizations, at least in democracies, is this pathway. People vote in national government, and then national governments act on, or national parliaments and national governments act on intergovernmental organizations, right? So the representatives to the United Nations, for example, aren't directly chosen by people. They're, chosen, they're members of the government who will appear, will be ambassadors to the UN, or national leaders will speak at the General Assembly. So some have critiqued that there's kind of a democratic deficit, that people themselves don't really have much say in how intergovernmental organizations are run. Particularly in non-democratic states, the people have no say in how intergovernmental organizations are run, because their national leaders aren't representing the will of the people in that country. So at least in democracies, you have, in theory, that the governments are representing the will of the people, but whether that actually takes place is sometimes questionable. But in non-democratic countries, that's highly, highly questionable. What's different with the European Union is, yes, there still is the national governments still have a say, right, in terms of operating through the European Council, the Council of Ministers. And so it's not to say that, national leaders and don't have any say. The European Council would be made up of different heads of government or heads of state. Council of Ministers is made up of different ministers depending on the issue, right? So if it's an economic issue, it would be ministers related to the economy. If it's security, it'd be, ministers of national defense, so governments. But the European Parliament is elected directly by the people. So there are European elections that are completely separate from national elections, where people vote in who their ministers or the members of the European Parliament will be. And so there's, European political parties. And so these are separate from national elections. And those members of the European Parliament don't sit in any national parliaments or national governments. Their role is purely within the European Union. And they play a role in the legislation that makes up the European, in the making of rules, pan-European rules. So in terms of democracy, this is fundamentally different, where people have an indirect route, but also a direct route into making decisions in the European Union, which is a really different and interesting innovation in structure. So the EU has kind of a unique institutional structure. So the EU's broad priorities are set by the European Council, which brings together national and EU level leaders. So they kind of talk about the broad priorities. What are the goals that we're hoping to look at? Directly elected members of European Parliament represent European citizens in the European Parliament, who play a legislative role. The interests of the EU as a whole are promoted by the European Commission. Members are appointed by national governments, right? So you get your bureaucrats, which are referred to. So the bureaucrats who work for the European Union, like the UN head of staff, well, so does the EU. And then governments defend their own country's national interests in the Council of the European Union, which also has a role in legislation, but it's more of a, where the members of the European Parliament, yes, they've got to get elected by their domestic constituencies, but they don't owe anything to the national government. Here's where kind of the national government gets a say. And depending on the issue area, it'll depend on which minister is defending the national interest. Involved in EU legislation are three different bodies. So you've got the European Parliament, which represents EU citizens and is directly elected. The Council of the European Union, which unfortunately the EU refers to, just uses the word council too often in sometimes confusing ways. So the Council of the European Union, if we just go back to here, would be otherwise would have been the Council of Ministers. Council of the European Union, which represents the governments of individual member countries. Presidency of the Council is shared by member states on a rotating basis. And then the European Commission, which represents the interest of the Union as a whole. So if we look at the kind of the arrows involved in legislation, we've got the Council of Ministers here, which can elect, appoint, or decide on legislation. We've got the European Parliament, and then we've got the European Commission, which proposes the legislation. So these three different bodies are involved in creating legislation for the European Union. And so you're seeing different interests that are coming in. The while chosen by national governments, the kind of the bureaucrats. We've got the representing individual member states, Council of the European Union, or Council of Ministers, and then the European Parliament, which is representing the people directly. There's other organizations within too, which are noteworthy. There's a European Court of Justice. It interprets EU law to make sure that it applies in the same way in all EU countries and settles legal disputes between national governments and EU institutions. So EU law must be applied in all EU countries. Right? That's kind of part of being, if you're accepted joining the European Union, then all EU regulations must be applied in all member states. And it can settle legal disputes between different national governments and EU institutions. It can also, in certain circumstances, be used by individuals, companies, or organizations to take actions against an EU institution if they feel it has somehow infringed on their rights. So if the EU's done something that somehow infringes on the rights of either an individual, company, or organization, they can go to the European Court of Justice to have it resolved. So what's the development of the European Union? Where does it come from? Given just how deep the connections are, it's interesting to trace the path of how we got from what starts as the European Coal and Steel Community all the way to the EU with a currency and everything. So the European coal and steel community, its initial proposal was to place Franco-German coal and steel production under a common authority. Steels are really important, coal and steel are really important in the production of weapons. And so this was kind of a way, if we could tie the Franco-German coal and steel industries together, and kind of the weapon industries together, is viewed as hopefully a path to avoid wars in the future. So that was kind of the goal, right? So it was based kind of on the principle of functionalism. So if coal and steel sound like fairly boring, it was kind of the idea. The issue involves what matters for engineers and technical experts and did not threaten politics, right? So if you could bring together people on a relatively, not necessarily simple, but technical issue, you could avoid some of the politics, and then you could resolve that issue because the engineers maybe don't care, or the technical experts maybe don't care as much about the politics side or the nationalism side, and then you can grow from there. So organization kind of serves a function, and because it's technical, it doesn't threaten politics. So at the end, the European Coal and Steel Community was established in 1951 with 6 member states: France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. In 1957, the Treaty of Rome was signed. It represented recognition that the community could not develop the coal and steel sectors in isolation from other economic sectors. So if you wanted to develop the coal and steel industries for all the member states, you needed integration in other economic sectors as well. Otherwise, you couldn't fully integrate or develop the coal and steel sectors. So there was a development of the common market, creation of common market through the removal of all restrictions on internal trade, the establishment of a common external tariff, reduction of barriers to free movement of people, services, and capital, development of common agriculture and transport policy, and through the establishment of a European Social Fund and European Investment Bank. So important here for looking removal of all restrictions on internal trade, right? So common market. So it's as if national barriers for trade aren't supposed to exist. So between, say, France and Germany, it's as if that barrier is not there for trade. Common external tariff, so common tariff on any products coming in to that zone from outside, and reductions on barriers to free movement of people, service, and capital. So people, services, and money across borders within the territory covered by the Treaty of Rome. There's also the common market for atomic energy, was created through Euratom. In 1987, we saw the establishment of the Single European Act, which expanded on the Treaty of Rome and the common market. So goal of completing a single market by December 1992 within the territory, by that point would have been establishment. It involved a complicated process of removing all remaining physical, fiscal, and technical barriers to trade, harmonizing different national health, food processing, and other standards, varying levels of indirect taxation, and barriers to movement of people. So just bringing down more and more barriers that would restrict trade. So you need money and stuff to be able to move across barriers, but also you needed ways of kind of harmonizing health, food processing, and other standards. If one country had, certain health or environmental standards, and another country had different health and environmental standards, it can make it difficult to have free movement of goods, right? If France is saying there's supposed to be free movement of goods, but France is saying we're not going to take this German good because it doesn't meet our environmental standards, that's in some ways a barrier to trade. And it may be for really what many would say legitimate reasons, but others could say, oh, they just put that in place because they don't want that German good. They want to protect French industry. So the only solution to that, or the best solution to that, is just come up with common standards. And if everybody has the same standards, then all industries are working to those standards, and we don't have those kind of non-tariff barriers to trade. It allowed banks and companies to do business throughout the community, European community residents to live, work, and draw pensions anywhere in the European community, and end to monopolies in sectors such as electricity and telecommunications. So you couldn't just have France has this monopoly on electricity from a French company and another, or in telecommunications. You know, you got your big French telecommunications company. You couldn't have that anymore. So, you know, a German company could come in and sell electricity or phones or telecommunications stuff. So really, you know, kind of allowed for kind of a European type citizenship where if you're a member of any European country, you could live anywhere within the European community. We had the Maastricht Treaty on the European Union, which took place in 1992, or signed in 1992. This was the formal formation of the European Union based on 3 pillars of the EU. So the original European community, so everything that had been set up previously through the Single European Act and the European Coal-Steel Community, all the way up to the Single European Act. So based on the European community, common foreign and security policy, which has had a rocky, or it's definitely an area that the EU has been less successful, and then home affairs and justice. It also involves European Monetary Union, so creation of a single European currency, the euro, by 1999. And that's also a relatively unique, that you had countries ditch their national currency in favor of adopting a single currency, which makes a lot of sense for the goals that they wanted to accomplish, right? Because having currency fluctuations it can be an impediment to trade across the zone. And it's just also, if you have free movement of people constantly changing currencies, it can be problematic. So it makes a lot of sense, but it's also, countries tend to be very tied nationalistically to their currency. So from that perspective, it's a major change. So that kind of concludes looking at the European Union. I want to turn a little bit to collective security organizations. So we've already talked a bit about them because the UN is a collective security organization at its core. But I want to focus a little bit about what does a collective security organization mean? What are the different types? We'll look at some examples. So what is first collective security? It rests on the notions of all against one. While states retain considerable autonomy over the conduct of the foreign policy, participants in the collective security organization fails a commitment by each member to join a coalition to confront any aggressor with opposing predominant strength. So the idea is that in a collective security organization, that if an attack on one is kind of an attack on all. So if while, you know, a state may be strong enough to attack another state, it's not strong enough to attack the entire international community, or all, probably not, or if international community is a global one, or all members of the region. So if a state knew that if it attacked another state, it would only be fighting that state, but it'd be fighting all other members of the collective security organization, the desire to attack should go down. You actually may still desire to attack, but your decision to attack is much less likely, because if you're looking at the prospects of success, it's much less likely, because you're going to be faced with preponderant strength. So it would take a very, very, very strong state to be able to, you know, go against all other states. So advantages: in theory, collective security makes for far more robust deterrence by ensuring that aggressors will be met with an opposing coalition that's preponderant rather than merely equivalent power, right? So if you're threatening a state and the threat back is all of us are going to attack you if you attack us, well, then that's a really strong threat of punishment. And so you may be much less likely in theory that states will be willing to use it or be willing to attack, given the knowledge that, or the threat that there's this massive coalition that would oppose them. And by institutionalizing the notion of all against one contributes to the creation of an international setting in which stability emerges through cooperation rather than through competition. If members of the collective security organization believe that deterrence is so strong that war becomes very unlikely, then they can ditch kind of policy making based on competition and can just work together to strengthen the organization, because they no longer fear each other. If anything, they want other members of the group to be strong because it makes the deterrent stronger, just so long as nobody becomes preponderant in strength all by themselves, that kind of a hegemon arises. But given that that's unlikely, you can solve different disputes or everything or different issues through cooperation rather than competition. So that's a goal that it could just lead to not only less war, but just a more cooperative international community. What are the different types of collective security organization? So they could take on many different institutional forms along the continuum ranging from ideal collective security to conflicts. And we'll look at what ideal collective security and conflict are. You should remember that these are kind of pure types, particularly ideal collective, kind of like an ideal type. So it's not necessarily saying that we're ever going to see one of this, but it's kind of most of the different organizations we'll see are kind of somewhere in the middle. So these organizations vary as to the number of members, geographic scope, and the nature of the commitments to collective action. So ideal collective security at one end of the spectrum is participation of all states of the world, covers all regions of the world, and involves a legally binding and codified commitment on the part of all members to respond to aggression whenever and wherever it might occur. So even the UN doesn't reach this standard, that legally binding codified commitment on the part of all member states to respond to aggression. While states are supposed to do the best they can, it's hard to say that it reaches that standard. Participation in the UN is near universal, but not necessarily universal. So the UN comes close, but even in the UN, there's been, under the UN system, there's been many wars where you didn't see the UN responding. So there's been many, many acts of aggression where we didn't see preponderant force on behalf of the UN responding. And so even the UN doesn't meet this standard. For an ideal collective security, it would have to be any time there's any aggression, you have an automatic response of the other member states to come to the defense of the one that's been attacked. Concert lies at the other end of the continuum. It represents the most attenuated or simple or weakest form of collective security. Though predicated on the notion of all against one, membership in a concert is restricted to the great powers of the day. A small group of major powers agree to work together to resist aggression. They meet on a regular basis to monitor events and, if necessary, to orchestrate collective initiatives. Concert's geographic scope is flexible. Members can choose to focus on a specific region or regions, or to combat aggression on a global basis. Finally, a concert entails no binding or codified commitments to collective action. Rather, the decisions are taken through informal negotiations through the emergence of consensus. So this is much weaker, where the other, with ideal, it's legally binding treaty requiring military response or requiring collective defense. Here it's not legally binding. It's not all states involved. It's just the great power. So there'll be a discussion based on it. What are the disadvantages of a concert? Well, in many ways, some of the kind of the perks of it, deterrence that you have in an ideal collective security just aren't there. There's not necessarily the knowledge of a state that if you attack, you'll be met with a preponderance of force. So the deterrent threat isn't quite as strong. The advantage is its flexibility, that states are more likely to be willing to join a concert knowing that there's not anything legally binding. Anytime a concert fails to act, it doesn't invalidate the entire organization, whereas in an ideal collective security organization to fail to act, it kind of weakens the entire organization and may destroy the entire organization, where the concert, because there's no legally binding, it's flexible, that it can make its decisions based on what it wants. And so one failure isn't really a failure. Focus on the major powers of the day. So it's also not like defending everyone. So the major powers are really more trying to restrict war between themselves. Whether they go to war with minor powers, they may discuss if it's, within their region, but there's no protection given to minor powers. And actions taken by the major powers outside of the region is something that is usually left out of the conflict. So the main example of conflict that we often talk about is the conflict of Europe, which took place at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So the great powers in Europe after the Napoleonic War wanting to avoid fighting each other. So it's kind of agreement to discuss and consult with each other over any kind of events taking place in Europe and try to solve it between themselves so they could avoid war. Outside of Europe, the states were pretty much free to do whatever they wanted so they could expand in colonization. The conflict of Europe was actually quite successful. There were relatively few instances of war between 1815 and 1914 within European context, which would lend some credibility to the idea of concert. But it's also important to remember that during that time, the European great powers or major powers were also pursuing colonies outside of Europe. So rather than using war within Europe to gain resources that they needed, they could gain these resources by just expanding their colonial holdings. And there was plenty of colonies that they could still grab up. So they didn't even necessarily have to come into much contact with each other outside. So they could gain their resources through other means. If there were no possibility of gaining colonies outside, would have the concert of Europe worked as well? We don't, there's no way of knowing for sure, but it's a good question to at least ask. The concert will obviously break apart at any point when major powers decide that they don't want to work together to resist aggression. If they decide, maybe war's not such a bad idea. But in any case, in any collective security organization, if enough of the great powers decide that war is a good idea, or it's an ideal collective security or concert, that organization's in trouble. So League of Nations is an important collective security organization established in 1820 through the Versailles Treaty. It was intended to include all countries and resist aggression globally. So its intention was to fall close to the ideal collective security. It was based on all members participating in the General Assembly. And there was a more powerful League Council, which kind of resembles Security Council, which included Britain, France, Japan, and Italy, with 4 rotating smaller powers. The US was supposed to be a 5th permanent council member, but did not ratify the League Charter. So Woodrow Wilson played an important role in helping to draft the League Charter, but at the end of the day, he couldn't get it ratified through the Senate. During the 1920s, Germany was given a permanent seat and the number of rotating members was increased. So Germany wasn't initially put in because, in 1920, this was a treaty that was put in place at the end of World War I, and Germany had lost World War I. So again, kind of your victors gain the spoils and gain the prominent positions in the international organizations that follow, and the losing ones play secondary roles. Italy had switched sides, and Japan was, now this was an important movement forward, the recognition of a non-European or also, I suppose, US outside, but kind of an Asian state as a great power was certainly an important step forward for the international community. But what we end up seeing when we look at the history of the League is if we look at these, 4 powers, eventually 5 powers, in the 1930s, Japan started aggression, Italy started aggression, Germany started aggression. So these were the 5 states that were, really supposed to be, were the permanent members who were supposed to be most responsible for maintaining peace. And 3 of your 5 were regularly engaging in aggression in different parts of the world. And without the US, Britain, France, certainly, and France didn't take an active role, and Britain just at that point just was declining in strength. It just didn't have the power to maintain peace everywhere in the world, particularly given that many of the major aggressors were some of the great powers of the world. Certainly couldn't go against Germany, Japan, and Italy all by itself. And so that was kind of a major flaw. So having some of the major powers not be totally committed, but also just not having the US, not having your arguably most powerful state, certainly by that point, if not the most powerful, certainly one of the most powerful states not there, is one of the great weaknesses of the League of Nations. And part of why we see the veto in the United Nations, that there is perceived the need to have all of the great powers of the day be in the Security Council. So Article 16 of the League of Nations Charter, aggressor states shall be deemed to have committed an act against all other member states of the League. So just so automatically be viewed as having be committed aggression against the League, and so there's supposed to be automatic economic and diplomatic sanctions against any aggressor state, which oftentimes in practice we did not see. So a failure of the League. Article 10, members must undertake to respect and preserve as against external aggression the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League. So this is the kind of your anti-war one. Undertake and respect territorial integrity and resist any aggression. So it doesn't specify though by what means should be used to meet this goal, right? So it says that everyone should, help to maintain the political independence of all members of the League, but it doesn't say what they're actually meant to do to meet this goal. Right, so it's a strongly worded condemnation. Does that count as preserving against external aggression of territorial integrity? Does that work? League Council will decide when force is required and recommend how much each country should contribute. In reality, this didn't really happen, in part because League Council recommendations must be unanimous. Right, so if the League Council is supposed to say, we should all be intervening here, well, when most of the aggression or many of the instances of aggression were at the behest of, members of the League Council, you were never going to get to unanimity, which led to multiple failures in the 1930s. Japanese attacks against China, Italian invasions of Ethiopia, and then eventual German aggression. And so the League was replaced by the UN following World War II. It didn't actually come to an end until the end of World War II, but I think it's fair to say by the start of World War II, nobody was really looking to the League anymore. And so the UN was designed to kind of if you look at the UN Charter, you see many influences from the League Charter, but trying to correct for some of the failures, from some of the things that led to its record its disastrous record in the 1930s. The United Nations. So we've talked about the UN. I just want to return to some of the provisions related to collective security. We have Article 42, which granted the Security Council the power to decide if and when a military response to aggressive action was required or was warranted. Article 43, member states must make available to the Security Council on its call and in accordance with the special agreement or agreements, armed forces, assistance, and facilities necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. So states are supposed to contribute at the request of the Security Council, armed forces, assistance, or facilities. So resources could be weaponry, armed forces, depending on what their agreement is with the United Nations, to participate in missions for maintaining peace and security. Concert of Europe, which we talked about a little bit before. So closer to the other spectrum. I mean, Concert of Europe was almost a pure concert, where both the UN and League of Nations were more aimed at coming closer to the ideal collective security. So Concert of Europe, established in 1815 by the Congress of Vienna at the close of the Napoleonic Wars, existed at least in name until 1914. Some argue that it ended in 1854 with the Crimean War, which took place between European great powers. But whether you put it to 1815 to 1854 or 1815 to 1914, it did, for an extended period of time, help to maintain peace in Europe, at least among the great powers. It's agreement between Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, with France joining in 1818, and membership restricted to the great powers in Europe, right? So it was a Eurocentric agreement. Members focused on regulating relations among each other and preserving peace in Europe. So it didn't matter about preserving peace outside of Europe. They wanted to avoid wars with each other. They dealt with disputes in other areas only when colonial conflicts threatened to spill over into Europe. So if there was a dispute between different colonies of different states, and if that threatened to affect relations among European great powers within Europe, that was something for the concert to discuss. But otherwise, if it didn't impact relations among the European great powers within Europe, then it wasn't really purview or something that the concert was going to deal with. The concert was predicated upon an understanding that each of the five powers would honor the territorial settlement reached at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. So in 1815, they'd all agreed on these are the borders for the European great powers, and kind of the idea that nobody really wanted a war. So since we just agreed on these borders, no one's going to challenge these borders. Members agreed to defend the territorial status quo or to allow changes only when they reach a consensus to do so. So if somebody challenged these agreed upon borders, then other states were meant to, based on an agreement, come in and help maintain the borders to avoid the outbreak of another Napoleonic War, another war where someone's trying to take over all of Europe. And only consensus could lead to the changing of borders. Involved informal decision-making procedures relying on consensus and without any formal mechanism for implementing collective security, right? So each case could be handled differently. It's not like the UN or League of Nations where you had a formal secretariat or formal staff members. There was no Concert of Europe staff or headquarters. So it's much more informal in its operation. And then finally, I want to talk about another regional one, but it's one that's important for, it's just been a successful and long-running organization. It's one that's still operating today, and it's one where Canada is a member, so it's an interesting one to look at. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a US-led military alliance formed in 1949 with mainly Western European members to oppose and deter Soviet power in Europe, right? So its main goal at its formation was it was formed at the early parts of the Cold War, and the goal was to keep the Soviet Union and its allies, so to keep the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, or eventual Warsaw Pact, out of Western Europe. Because there's fears that they would try to expand and take over Western European states. And so in particular, the Western Europeans wanted a way to, keep the US tied to them and tied to defending them. So it's a collective defense organization headquartered in Brussels, Belgium, and the Supreme Allied Commander is always an American general. So the Supreme Military Commander of NATO is always an American. Article 5, which is the kind of the backbone of NATO as a collective security organization. The parties agreed that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against all, and consequently they agreed that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51, so returned to Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party were parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. So invoking the right of individual or collective self-defense, which is enshrined in the United Nations Charter, saying that if there's an attack against one member of NATO, it's considered to be an attack against all the different members. And so all members are required to respond and help to maintain the territorial integrity and come to the self-defense of the attacked state. So the idea here would be that, we thought that the Western European states were the most vulnerable to attack. So if the Soviet Union were to attack a Western European state, Article 5 state that all other members, and most notably the United States, was obligated to come to the self-defense of. Now, interestingly, while it was always assumed that this provision would be used to bring the United States into defending Western Europe, the only time Article 5 was invoked was after the United States was attacked on 9/11. Interestingly, it was only invoked when the only time it was ever invoked was when the United States was attacked. Although you could actually make the argument that the fact that it was only had to be invoked after a terrorist attack maybe shows the strength of the commitment, and that you could make an argument. It's impossible to know whether it's true that the strength of NATO is what made it so that Article 5 never had to be invoked within Western Europe. But we couldn't know what history would look like without Article 5. Now, Article 5 has kind of been at the core of NATO since its inception, and it's something that leaders of different countries have backed up and repledged their commitment to. So it was very noteworthy early in President Trump's presidency when he was less committal towards Article 5, and certainly less committal towards the collective self-defense. Why should Americans die for the war-hungry Montenegrins? Somehow Montenegro became a war-loving country in President Trump's eyes. And now he's gone back and forth, and sometimes has come closer to, defending the Article 5 principle, but it certainly raised a lot of eyebrows when an American president was much less committal on Article 5. Cold War membership, so membership of NATO. So it's starting in 1949 with the states, so mainly Western Europe, but also Canada and the United States. 1952, Greece and Turkey, which is an interesting pairing given that they're NATO members who have actually fought wars against each other. 1955, Germany joined as West Germany, and it merged with East Germany in 1990. And in 1982, we had Spain join. Now, what's one of the more interesting topics related to NATO, so the Cold War membership fits easily and is easily explained within the context of the Cold War. You had the two major blocks. You had the NATO bloc, the Western bloc, and you had the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, so the Eastern bloc. And so you had kind of your two different alliance structures. But what's one of the more interesting topics related to NATO is what's happened since the end of the Cold War. Because many argued that NATO, once the Soviet threat went away, NATO would go away. It was an organization created to counter NATO, and so, to counter the Soviet Union. So when you have no Soviet Union, there's no more reason for NATO. In fact, some would have thought that you'd start seeing increased tension with the decline of Russia. You'd start seeing increased tension among, say, some Western European states and potentially potentially the United States, kind of in a repower balancing. But in fact, what we end up seeing is that NATO has continued to expand in two different manners. It's continued to expand in terms of membership, pushing east, and in terms of its mission expansion. So it's also taken on new missions. So in 1999, we saw the addition of the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. 2004, extension to Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. In 2009, Albania and Croatia. And in 2017, to Montenegro. And so we saw pushing into the Eastern Bloc, taking up many of the former Eastern Bloc states, and getting closer and closer to, or getting closer and right up against Russia's border. So this was definitely a point of contention between the West and Russia in the 1990s in particular, and the early 2000s was, here's this security organization that its whole kind of forming purpose was to counter the Soviet Union, and now it's pushing right up against Russia's borders. And so to Russia, seeing this and seeing that, you know, NATO still seems to be poised against Russia, and Russia has lost its buffer. It used to have kind of satellite states, part of the Warsaw Pact, Eastern Bloc states that were buffers against, you know, Soviet Union or Russia itself. And now you've got, you know, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania right on the border with Russia. And so that's definitely an increased threat to Russia. So that's certainly a point of contention. Also a mission expansion. So because, you know, NATO's primary mission was to counter the Soviet Union, it needed a new mission. It needed something new to do. And so it's expanded its mission to not only still maintain the territorial integrity of, you know, member states, but also security through promotion of democracy and human rights. So kind of the idea that you're not going to have global security without democracy and human rights. So it's kind of NATO's requirement, if it wants peace, to promote democracy and human rights. It also involved participation in missions outside of NATO territory. For example, Bosnia, which was certainly a very contentious decision that got you know, a lot of opposition from states, particularly larger states outside of NATO, saying how can NATO be claiming the right to collective self-defense in a territory that's not that of a member state. So NATO would essentially made the claim that Article 51, the right to collective self-defense, doesn't require that the defended state, you know, be a NATO member, so that it could go wherever it wanted on the principle of collective self-defense. So it's participated, so it's expanded its mission to different missions, so promotion of democracy and human rights, and it's also expanded its mission geographic scope, so not just within NATO territory, but also outside of NATO territory. And then just quickly, one slide on non-governmental organizations. We spent past time talking about intergovernmental organizations. So what do non-governmental organizations do? They provide voluntary organizations whose members are individuals or associations that come together to achieve a common purpose. Some organizations are formed to advocate a particular cause. So we call these like advocacy groups, such as human rights, peace, or environmental. Others are established to provide services such as disaster relief, humanitarian aid in war-torn societies, or developmental assistance. So many of them are just, you know, that you think of Amnesty International, the Red Cross has national chapters, but it also has kind of an international confederation of these different national ones. And so it's important to remember the kind of the two main, you know, some organizations will do both advocacy and service, and some will be focused more on one. So many of them will have a cause and they're going to advocate. So, you know, you've got environmental protection, NGOs that are big in trying to advocate for changes in policies. So they're going to take actions to put pressure to try to change policies. Others are more related to doing things, so to help bring capacity to areas that don't have capacity. So, you know, when there's disaster relief, they'll send people in to help with the cleanup. If there's a war-torn society, they're going to help bring in themselves humanitarian aid. Get some, oftentimes humanitarian aid from states may not be forthcoming or may be slow. So international civil society organizations acting on behalf of people will bring in humanitarian aid. or developmental assistance will help actually go on the ground and help bring in technical expertise, help bring in material to help countries develop. There are thousands of NGOs dealing with so many different issue areas of different sizes, scopes, and performing different services. And like IGOs, the different geographic scopes and functions that they serve. All right, that concludes our lecture on international organizations. If you have any questions, feel free to comment or send an email. We'll also be able to have a discussion on Zoom where we can talk through any questions you might have about international organizations or about international politics. So I'll post another video for the next topic soon, so keep your eyes open for that, and have a great day.